All right, we're getting ready for mission number 3 from Fortress Rabaul, the campaign for wing leader. Decided to go with a heavy bomber raid on the port since the airfield still has, even after it recovers 8 hits, still has 16 hits on it. The fighters are pushed to the limit in launching this raid. They're unable to take, if they take any more than 2 losses on this turn, they'll be unable to fly on the next day. Japanese can always fly 4 squadrons. So that's, I guess, hitting the airfield just seemed like a diminishing return at this point. You need to start going to work at the port and knocking it down in preparation for the invasion of Bougainville. I also had heavy bombers available, so I had 5 squadrons of B-24s. I could put them into close formation, which means they're stacked together 2 by 2 and then 1 in trail. And the B-24 is going to bomb from altitude 8 or higher, and the port has a +1 defensive modifier to it. And so we decided to go ahead and use those, but go ahead and send up fighters since the weather is good. And it seemed well to go ahead and defend those bombers as best as we can. Rolled snake eyes for the weather, so we do have haze. And it's easy to forget that that marker is there, so I tend to put the haze marker directly over primary targets as a reminder so I don't forget to use that modifier. So that's the situation. Now, I'm doing something different with the Japanese interceptors. I've moved them further back. I've also, avoiding the mistake I feel like the Americans made in the last mission, I had too many on escort and not enough, I didn't have any sweepers. And I think that kind of cost the Americans a bit. Even though it felt like they won that scenario, they were lucky to do so. Very lucky to do so. So rather than play with fire, I decided to go ahead and break things up again and put in a couple of wing formation sweepers and just put a couple on escort. B-24s are pretty tough to defeat anyways. They're probably the only bomber force I would feel comfortable sending up unescorted against the Japanese interceptors. So I've got them all ready to go here at altitude, 9 for the bombers, and then the sweepers at high altitude, 13. I want to make sure the Japanese, if they want to start at altitude 12, that they're going to be at a disadvantage. Now that poses a problem for the Japanese, of course, because they can't start any higher than altitude 12, and they perform poorly at altitude 13 and up. More poorly than they do otherwise, I should say. So I backed them up, giving them space to be able to claw for altitude and get up to altitude 14 before the American sweepers presumably would be in a position to get a tally and beat them to altitude 14. Again, it's the name of the game is gaining initiative on your opponent by using the altitude. Also backed up all of the mid and low altitude interceptors in an effort to get them to altitude advantage over the sweepers and the bomber formation. Really not interested in going after the bombers with the Japanese so much as I am at pummeling the American fighters. If I can keep the fighters down, the bombers, eventually I will be able to get at them on future missions. We'll hope that the flak and the fact that there's a cover of haze over the whole battlefield, that will be enough to prevent serious damage on the port. And so that's the strategy on the opposite side of the field. So we're going to go ahead and play out the mission, see how things go. We'll report back when this mission is complete. Okay, we just finished up the raid on the port of Rabaul. First time we've struck the port with the American bombers. There's no B-24 losses. As I said, I tended to focus with the Japanese interceptors on the P-38s. And the kill ratio racked up was favorable finally to the Japanese. They inflicted a total of 6 losses on the P-38s. They suffered 10 in exchange. These were pre-existing losses in that box. So 10-6. The Japanese still can't win the war with that kind of attrition rate, but they can certainly win this campaign with that particular attrition rate, and so that works in my favor for the Japanese. For the Americans, what's going to happen here is for every 3 markers they pull out of here, the fighter sorties marker is going to move 1 to the left. And so it can move no further than that. So that's going to leave 3 markers in that box, which is going to impact future raiding capability, future escort capability. The Japanese are going to pull their marker to the left for every 8 that they pull out of here. So there's a total of 15 in there. So that's going to move the marker just one space, and it'll leave 7 behind. But the marker is always going to slide 1 to the right, and there's a 4. So the Japanese are always going to send up 4 interceptors. The Americans, it's always going to slide to the right 1, but there's a 0 in that spot. So the next raid that if the Americans choose to raid on the next day, it will be an unescorted raid. But the fighters might not be able to sortie anyways if the weather is perhaps poor. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. As far as the bombing, it was successful. The first bomber rolled very high, rolled a 10. It was a veteran bomber, so that helped him out a bit, and that really made the mission a success. So they just barely got crippling damage on the port, so that's going to be worth 1 point. Despite the damage coming off the airfields, there's still crippling damage on that, so that's another point. So that's going to move the CVPs up 2 spaces. And so that puts it only 2 away from the win column for the Americans. Americans need to end the campaign with 7. Now, there are some ways that the Japanese can move that marker backwards. That has to do with towards the end of the campaign. If there's not enough damage points on the airfield, the marker will start sliding backwards when the invasion of Bougainville begins. When the invasion of Bougainville begins and the cruisers that move into Rabaul, if they're not damaged sufficiently, that can also move that marker backwards. So it's not time to panic yet, but it is a matter of some concern that marker is going to move twice one more time. So the real tough decisions now come for the Americans. What to do next as the next day begins to settle in and we see what the weather is. Is it worth maybe running a B-25 raid unescorted? I'm a little reluctant to do that because the B-25s are more vulnerable to those interceptors. So I'm kind of reluctant to do that. I'm going to need those B-25s strong to go after the cruisers when the time comes. That's the situation here at the end of the October 25th turn. We might just have to sit out the 26th and see what the weather does from there. And if we sit it out, and assuming that the weather marker moves 1 per turn, we could be sitting out 1, 2, 3, 3 days, perhaps raiding again on the 4th. On the 31st, the weather will remove back to the start point. So there might be a pause in operations. We'll have to wait and see what the weather does here.